Moving to a new apartment in the bustling city of New York in 2024 was supposed to be a fresh start for Alex Carter. At 26, Alex was just like any other young adult struggling to balance a career, relationships, and the constant pressure to make it in life. But there was something about this new place that felt off. The rent was suspiciously cheap for the city, and the landlord seemed too eager to seal the deal. But Alex ignored the red flags. After all, who wouldn't jump at the chance to live alone in Manhattan? The first night in the apartment, the silence was almost unnerving. No cars honking, no sounds of neighbors. It was eerily quiet. As Alex unpacked boxes, exhaustion set in, and all he could think about was sleep. The moment his head hit the pillow, sleep came like a heavy wave. But it wasn't peaceful. In the middle of the night, Alex awoke to a strange sensation. The air felt thicker, almost suffocating. The darkness in the room was unnatural, like it was swallowing the light from the street outside. As he blinked, everything shifted. One second he was lying in his new bed, and in the next he was standing in a decrepit hallway. The walls were cracked, with a putrid stench of decay seeping through the air. "What the?" Alex whispered, his voice trembling. His heart pounded as he turned around, realizing he was no longer in his apartment. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, with dim, flickering lights hanging from the ceiling. He tried to pinch himself, thinking it was a dream. But it wasn't. The pain was all too real. As he took a cautious step forward, a low growl echoed from behind him. Cold sweat drenched his skin. He turned around to find nothing. But the growl came again, this time closer. The walls seemed to pulse as if they were alive. Panicking, Alex shut his eyes tight, and when he opened them, he was back in his apartment, gasping for air. What just happened, he thought, clutching his chest. He tried to convince himself it was just a nightmare, but the lingering smell of rot told him otherwise. Little did Alex know, this was just the beginning. Every time he blinked, his reality would twist into something darker, more sinister. The next morning, Alex couldn't shake off the unsettling experience. The memory of that grotesque hallway haunted him, and he noticed that the air in his apartment now carried that same faint stench. Determined to find an explanation, Alex decided to stay awake as long as possible. If he didn't blink, maybe he could stop the strange shifts from happening. For hours, Alex forced his eyes open, but eventually, exhaustion took over. A single, involuntary blink, and he was gone again. This time, he found himself in a blood-soaked room. The walls dripped with crimson liquid, and disfigured corpses hung from the ceiling, their lifeless eyes staring at him. A scream caught in his throat as a shadow moved in the corner of his vision. He tried to blink his way out, but nothing happened. "No, no, no!" He blinked again, more desperately. The shadows crept closer, revealing grotesque figures with hollow eyes and jagged teeth. They were human once, or at least something that resembled humans. Now they were twisted, monstrous forms that crawled toward him like predators sensing fear. Alex's only option was to run. Sprinting down a series of dark corridors, he could hear the creature's guttural breaths and wet footsteps behind him. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to get away. In a blind panic, he crashed through a door, tripping into an abyss of darkness. As he fell, he shut his eyes in terror, and suddenly, he was back. Panting heavily, he was lying on his living room floor, safe or so he thought. He could still hear the echo of those creatures' snarls in his mind. The sun had set hours ago, leaving Alex alone in his dimly lit apartment. The silence was thick, pressing in on him like a suffocating blanket. He sat hunched on his couch, eyes bloodshot and burning from lack of sleep. The fear of blinking had turned into an all-consuming paranoia. For 3 days, he had been jumping between dimensions, each one more grotesque and horrifying than the last. Alex's hands trembled as he took a sip of cold coffee, the bitter taste doing nothing to keep his eyelids from drooping. Every time he blinked, the world around him could change, throwing him into another nightmare. His heart pounded and his breaths were shallow, every nerve in his body on edge. He was afraid of closing his eyes, even for a fraction of a second. Suddenly, a knock echoed through the apartment, startling him so badly that he nearly dropped the coffee mug. It wasn't the polite, gentle knock of a neighbor. No, it was slow and deliberate, each thud vibrating through the walls, as if whoever was on the other side was savoring the sound. Alex, he hadn't seen anyone for days. No friends, no neighbors, not even a delivery man. He didn't want to open the door, but the knocking grew louder, more insistent, each beat pounding in sync with his racing heart. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. Maybe it's help, he thought, trying to convince himself. He approached the door cautiously, every step feeling like it could be his last. The peephole was dark, offering no hint of who might be on the other side. Swallowing his fear, Alex turned the knob and pulled the door open. Standing there was a man dressed in a long, dark coat, his face hidden in the shadows cast by the hallway's flickering lights. But it wasn't the stranger's attire that made Alex's blood run cold. It was his eyes. They were completely black, like two bottomless pits that seemed to swallow the light around them. "Alex Carter, right?" the man asked, his voice low and chilling, sending an icy shiver down Alex's spine. There was something in the tone, a twisted amusement, as if he knew something Alex didn't. How do you know my name?" Alex stammered, trying to steady his shaking hands. He took a step back, desperate to put some distance between himself and this unsettling figure. The stranger smiled, revealing sharp, needle-like teeth. "Oh, I know far more than just your name," he said, stepping forward. The air around him seemed to warp, distorting the light and casting grotesque shadows that danced across the walls. "I know you've been slipping between worlds, haven't you? Every time you close your eyes, you slip just a little further." Alex's throat tightened. How did this man know? Who was he? His mind raced, searching for answers, but all he found was terror. "What do you mean? What's happening to me?" he demanded, his voice cracking. The stranger's grin widened, his black eyes reflecting nothing but darkness. "You're caught in between, Alex. You've crossed into places you were never meant to see. You've been marked by them," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, as if sharing a sinister secret. "The more you blink, the deeper you go. They're waiting for you to slip one last time, so they can pull you in completely." The words sent a chill down Alex's spine. "Who are they?" he managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper. The stranger tilted his head, his grin never wavering. "Let's just say, they're the ones who dwell in the spaces between your reality and theirs, the ones who feast on the fear of those who wander too far." Alex's heart was racing, the room spinning around him. He was losing his grip. "What do they want from me?" he pleaded, his voice laced with desperation. "Simple," the man said, his eyes narrowing. "They want your soul, Alex. They've been feeding on the terror you feel every time you blink. But they're not done yet. You see, fear is sweetest when it's ripened to perfection." Before Alex could react, the man lunged forward with unnatural speed. In a panic, Alex shut his eyes, praying it would pull him away. For a moment, everything went dark, the air around him shifting. But this time, when he opened his eyes, he was no longer in his apartment. Alex found himself in a decrepit, decaying cathedral. The once grand structure was now a twisted ruin, its stained glass windows shattered, casting fragments of distorted light across the stone floor. The air was thick with the stench of rot, and the distant sound of tortured screams echoed through the darkness. The stranger was gone, but his words lingered in Alex's mind like a curse. The creatures he spoke of, were they here in this hellish place? Alex's heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled forward, trying to find an exit, any way out of this nightmare. As he turned a corner, the shadows seemed to move on their own, twisting and writhing as if alive. From the darkness, figures began to emerge, grotesque, half-rotted bodies with hollow eyes and gaping mouths that oozed with black tar. They moved slowly at first, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by unseen hands. "Stay back!" Alex screamed, his voice breaking. But the creatures ignored his pleas, Their eyes locked onto him with a hunger that sent a wave of nausea through his stomach. They were closing in, surrounding him on all sides. In a blind panic, Alex squeezed his eyes shut again. Please, please take me back, he thought desperately. But this time, when he opened his eyes, he wasn't back in his apartment. Instead, he found himself in a narrow corridor, the walls slick with a thick black substance that pulsed like a beating heart. The sound of whispers filled the air, voices chanting in a language he couldn't understand. The temperature had dropped, his breath visible in the cold air. Then he saw him, the stranger with the black eyes, standing at the end of the corridor. You can't run from them, Alex, he said, his voice echoing eerily. Every blink only brings you closer to their domain. Soon you won't be able to escape. No, no, that's not true, Alex shouted, backing away. But there was nowhere to go. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness swallowing everything around him. The stranger took a step closer, his grin now monstrous. There's only one way to end this, he whispered. Stop blinking, Alex, or give in. The realization hit Alex like a punch to the gut. The only way to escape was to stop blinking. Forever. But how long could he hold on? His eyes were already burning, tears streaming down his face. He could feel his willpower slipping, the urge to blink becoming unbearable. And as his eyelids fluttered, that suffocating darkness began to close in around him once more, ready to devour him whole. Alex's eyes were bloodshot, burning with exhaustion, every nerve in his body screaming for him to blink. But he couldn't. He stumbled through the dark, shifting corridor, the walls throbbing as if they were alive. The air was thick with the stench of rot, and that relentless whisper filled his mind. Blink, and it will end. But Alex knew better. Each blink had only pulled him deeper into this twisted nightmare. Each time his eyes closed, reality twisted, and he was thrown into a world more horrific than now, as he found himself in a cavernous chamber, he realized there was no escaping it. In the center of the room, the black-eyed stranger sat on a throne made of bones, his grin stretching impossibly wide. The shadows around him seemed to breathe, as if they were alive, and the air crackled with an unnatural energy. You've come so far, Alex, the stranger hissed, his voice dripping with mockery. But you're at your limit. Just one more blink, and you'll be ours forever. Alex's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the pressure building behind his eyelids. His eyes were tearing up, vision blurred, but he forced himself to stay focused. No, I won't let you take me, he muttered through gritted teeth. The stranger leaned forward, his black eyes gleaming. Oh, but you will. You've been running, fighting, but everyone breaks eventually. Your eyes are betraying you, Alex. Just blink. The voices around him swelled to a fevered pitch, whispering his name, urging him to surrender. Every part of him ached to close his eyes just for a second. The darkness clawed at the edges of his vision, and he could feel his strength draining away. But then, in a sudden moment of clarity, Alex realized something. This world, these monsters, they feed on fear. As long as I'm afraid, they'll control me. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the panic in his chest. The stranger's grin faltered for a split second, sensing the shift in Alex's resolve. What are you doing? The stranger hissed, his voice laced with sudden fury. Instead of blinking, Alex did the unthinkable. He closed his eyes on his own terms, embracing the darkness. The world around him fell silent, the whispers fading into nothingness. For a moment, there was only cold emptiness, like floating in a void. The creature's cold fingers brushed against his skin, but he held on, refusing to let them in. I'm not afraid, he told himself. I'm in control. Slowly, he opened his eyes, expecting the worst. But instead of horror, he found himself standing back in his apartment. The soft morning light filtered through the blinds, bathing. It seemed almost peaceful, but Alex knew better. This wasn't the end. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the shadows, stood the black-eyed stranger, his grin now twisted with rage. You may have escaped for now, he spat, his voice a venomous hiss. But you'll never truly be free. We are always watching. Alex's heart skipped a beat, but this time he didn't flinch. He wasn't the same terrified man who had been running for days. The nightmare had changed him, forged him into something stronger. Maybe you're right, Alex said, his voice steady. But I won't blink, not for you, not ever again. The stranger's form flickered, his grin slowly fading as the room grew darker. But Alex stood his ground, refusing to let fear control him. He had faced the monsters, the darkness, and himself. Whatever came next, he was ready.